Hey everyone, settle in. Maybe grab some tea, something mild. Nothing with caffeine and dim that screen light until it's just a soft glow. Because tonight, we're taking a long, slow walk through one of humanity's strangest, coziest obsessions. Mushrooms? Yeah, the weird little umbrellas that pop up after the rain. You've seen them on your pizza? Maybe in your soup? And if you've been to a music festival, well, you might have seen other types too. But how far back does this relationship go? When did we first go? Hey, that squishy thing under the log looks edible. Or maybe spiritual? Spoiler, pretty early, like before anyone could spell the word specious. Early. Let's start there around 20,000 years ago, on a planet colder, quieter, and full of people mostly trying not to die. Somewhere out there, our ancestors were already sniffing around the forest floor. And one day, probably out of boredom or hunger or a dare someone didn't live to regret, they picked up a mushroom. Let's call him Grug, because all early humans in stories sound like that. Grug eats the fungus. His friends watch. Grug starts giggling at clouds. And that, arguably, was the dawn of two great traditions: human curiosity and bad decisions. But, jokes aside, the earliest confirmed use of mushrooms comes from prehistoric archaeological and mural evidence stretching across continents. For example, in what's now Spain, ancient rock art from around 6000 BCE shows little humanoid figures dancing with mushrooms sprouting around them. Imagine a Neolithic rave, minus the strobe lights. These were probably Psilocybe hispanica, the famous magic mushrooms. So yes, before agriculture, before Netflix, before currency, humans were out here tripping on forest snacks. What's more interesting is, they didn't seem to think of it as fun. They thought it was holy. In many early societies, mushrooms weren't food, they were a bridge between the living and the divine, the everyday world and whatever lay beyond. To them, the hallucinations weren't random fireworks of neurons, they were messages from gods, spirits, ancestors. If you think that is unreasonable, keep in mind, when your daily entertainment is just firelight and rain, even a talking tree branch seems profound. Now, let's float to Siberia. Cold, bleak, and perfect for mysticism. The local shamans. They're the ones we now call Tunguzik or Iwenki used. A bright red mushroom with white dots. Amanita muscaria. Yes, the classic Mario mushroom. Cute in video games, disturbingly potent in real life. The shamans would dry these mushrooms, string them up near the fire, and sometimes leave them as gifts. Sound familiar? Red with white spots, handed out by a man in fur clothing, who comes once a year in winter. Some historians think our image of Santa Claus has roots here. Essentially, the first Christmas miracle was a Siberian shaman high on mushrooms climbing through someone's chimney to share visions of flying reindeer. History is rarely elegant tits, just weird with better lighting. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs called mushrooms tea, meaning the flesh of the gods, which, if you think about it, is both deeply spiritual and just a bit alarming as a dinner invitation. They used these mushrooms in religious ceremonies that combined singing, chanting, and collective visions. To them, these experiences were a way to talk to deities and predict the future. Spanish chroniclers who witnessed these rituals in the 6th century described them with a mix of awe and judgment, like priests walking into Burning Man for the first time. Those same priests, by the way, did not approve. They called mushroom rituals satanic illusions and tried very hard to stamp them out, which, spoiler again, didn't completely work. People kept doing it, quietly, for centuries. Now, not all ancient people used mushrooms for mystical revelations. Some just wanted to survive. In China, for instance, mushrooms became tools of medicine long before they were symbols of spirituality. As early as 2500 BCE, traditional Chinese healers classified mushrooms into those that nourished life and those that, well, didn't. The reishi mushroom, known as lingi, was considered the mushroom of immortality, believed to balance the life force and extend longevity. You could almost say fungi were ancient China-esque. Natural pharmacy of pharmacies were made of damp trees and cryptic legends. Similarly, Egyptian hieroglyphs from around 1400 BCE show that pharaohs considered mushrooms divine. Ordinary citizens were forbidden from eating them because obviously something that doesn't rot easily and appears magically overnight must be a gift from the gods. Because logic, so fungi weren't just food, they were royal exclusives, like luxury handbags that sprout in dirt. Now on, this is my favorite part, Chirup. Joined the mushroom drama much later and with significantly less grace. Medieval Europeans mostly distrusted mushrooms. To them, if something didn't grow neatly in daylight, it was suspicious. Mushrooms were labeled toadstools, which roughly translates to definitely poisonous. But good luck. There's a reason fairy tales love them. In folklore, mushrooms were homes for elves, witches, and the occasional drunk goblin. No one in the 14th century saw a mushroom and thought, dinner. They thought, that's how you get cursed. But, ever practical, peasants eventually started eating safe wild species, like chanterelles and porcini. The nobles. They joined later because even back then, trends started at the bottom and worked their way up to the castle table. Let's float gently over to the ancient Romans and Greeks, because if there was luxury involved, they were never far behind. To Romans, mushrooms were delicacies, opulent and slightly dangerous. Emperor Claudius, famous for his stuta, limpa, and General Clulus Nasuas, allegedly murdered by one. His wife Agrippina slipped him a poisonous Amanita phalloides, the infamous death cap. The irony, Romans called mushrooms food of the gods. Claudius did, in fact, join them just quicker than expected. The Greeks had their own mushroom theories, linking them to thunder and lightning. They believed mushrooms grew where Zeus struck the ground, a poetic way of saying, we don't understand fungi yet. At this point in human history, mushrooms had worn many hats. Medicine, poison, sacrament, and suspicious fairy furniture. But the big question remains, how did we go from ancient rituals to sautéed mushrooms on toast? That culinary transformation took millennia. In Europe, mushroom farming didn't become a thing until the 17th century. In France, of course, because if civilization had a culinary guinea pig, it was France. Parisian farmers began cultivating mushrooms in the cool, dark tunnels under the city-abandoned limestone quarries that were perfect for growing fungi. That's how the champignon de Paris, or Bhutan mushroom, entered high society. What began as sacred turned into dinner garnish. Typical human evolution, really. Now, before we drift too far into modern kitchens, let's slow things down. Breathe in. Imagine the Earth's earliest forests, gigantic ferns, towering mushrooms as tall as trees. That's not fantasy around 400 million years ago. Before the dinosaurs, massive fungal structures called prototexites ruled the land. These were like skyscraper-sized fungi, probably the largest living things on Earth at the time. So, technically, before humans used mushrooms, mushrooms used the Earth. And that's a relaxing thought to end on, for now. Alright, welcome back. Night one. If you're still here, it means you either really like history, or you're too sleepy to find the stop button. Either way, let's keep floating. We left off somewhere between ancient Romans poisoning each other with fancy mushrooms and prehistoric art enthusiasts painting them on cave walls. Tonight, we drift through the Middle Ages era, famous for bad hygiene, confusing politics, and worse medical advice. Spoiler, mushrooms didn't escape the chaos. In medieval Europe, mushrooms had what you might call a PR crisis. Two ordinary people. Fungi were moody and unpredictable. They could feed you, cure you, or flatten you. There was no reliable way to tell which was which, except by trial and error, and medieval folks had enough plagues going around already. So most left mushrooms alone. That might explain why old herbals, the medical books of the time, often avoided the subject altogether. You could find pages about saints' bones, unicorn horns, or the healing power of prayer butt mushrooms. Barely a mention. When they did appear, it was usually with a polite warning, like don't. Still, curiosity didn't die out entirely. Some monks in secluded monasteries quietly studied wild fungi. They noticed patterns how some mushrooms appeared on tree roots, others on damp ground. They tasted a few. The brave survived long enough to write things down. The reckless became ghost stories. And then came one particular fungus that would haunt Europe's bread for centuries. Ergot was not your typical mushroom, but a mold that infected grains, especially rye. When people ate contaminated bread, they experienced terrifying hallucinations, violent spasms, and burning limbs. The condition became known as St. Anthony's fire, which sounds noble but felt like hell. Victims believed they were cursed or possessed. Entire villages fell into hysteric fits. If this sounds familiar, yes, many scholars now think the strange behaviors and incidents like the Salem witch trials may have been caused by ergot poisoning. So, in a way, mushrooms, well, fungal cousins accidentally invented witchcraft hysteria. You can't make history stranger than that. Now, even while Europe was panicking about bread mold, the East continued using fungi in quieter, deeper ways. In Japan, shiitake mushrooms appeared in recorded texts as early as the 10th century CE. They were considered both medicine and luxury. Emperors accepted baskets of them as tribute, while healers praised their vitality-boosting effects. Centuries later, modern science would confirm their immune benefits. But back then, it was all intuition and possibly wishful thinking. Chinese medicine, too, evolved its own fungal legends. Monks and scholars prized the reishi mushroom so much that legends called it the elixir of life. If you found one in the wild, it was said to be a heavenly sign. China's first emperor, Qin Shi Huang, sent fleets across the sea in search of the mushroom of immortality. His ships never returned, so either they sank or they found it and decided not to share. Let's glide over to another continent, in the dense jungles of Central Africa. The Bantu people had their own relationship with mushrooms, not sacred, not medicinal, just deeply practical. Mushrooms were seasonal miracles. When the rains came, entire families went searching for clean, edible species, passing knowledge down through generations. That tradition survives today. Unlike in Europe, African folklore treated mushrooms not as suspicious strangers, but as familiar forest friends. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the indigenous peoples of North America had long used puffballs and bracket fungi for healing wounds. Crushed puffball spores worked as antiseptics before bandages existed. It's humble, but it probably saved lives when medieval Europe was still arguing about whether diseases were punishment from God, of course. Europeans eventually rediscovered that mushrooms weren't all poison and witchcraft. Somewhere in Renaissance Italy, someone finally did the brave thing, ate one fancy-looking mushroom, and didn't die. The trend spread. By the 1600s, French gardeners were experimenting with cultivating edible fungi on purpose, mostly under horse stables, to mimic rich soil decay. It worked surprisingly well, and because France had the unofficial patent on culinary arrogance, they declared mushrooms the new luxury. Restaurants in Paris started serving sautéed mushrooms with butter and wine. Thé caudit, Tim champignons. Because fungus didn't sound elegant enough for menus, nobles ate them to feel cultured. Peasants farmed them in secret caves to feel employed. Soon, other Europeans followed. The British added mushrooms to steak pies. Germans pickled them. Italians baked them on flatbread, which, many centuries later, would give us the modern pizza topping. Congratulations, fungi! You finally became none. But somewhere, people were still chasing the older, louder magic of mushrooms, the visionary kind. Indigenous traditions in Central America never stopped using psychedelic mushrooms, even under colonial rule. Rituals were held in secret. Songs whispered in hidden languages. Then, in the 1950s, an American banker named R. Gordon Wasson sat in a small house in Oaxaca, Mexico, and took part in one of those ceremonies. It blew his mind literally and figuratively. He wrote about it for a magazine. And suddenly, the Western world rediscovered magic mushrooms. Like it was a brand new concept. Spoiler, it wasn't. It was thousands of years old, just ignored because it didn't fit neatly into church sermons or dinner tables. This rediscovery indirectly launched the psychedelic movement of the 1960s, and that is how a humble forest fungus went from sacred ritual tool to counterculture icon to government target. As for the science, the 20th century brought better understanding. Mycologists, those rare people who make fungi sound glamorous, began cataloging mushroom species. Penicillin, discovered by Alexander Fleming in 1928, came from a mold. Suddenly, humanity realized fungi weren't just for ceremonies or food, they could save lives. It's hard not to admire the irony. The same kingdom of life that scared people for centuries became the foundation of modern medicine. Without fungi, no antibiotics. Without antibiotics, no modern world. Pretty poetic for something that grows on rot. Yet, for all our progress, we're still fumbling through the same fascination our ancestors had. We marvel at mushrooms in nature documentaries, pick them on weekend hikes, and occasionally cook the wrong ones. We pop fungal capsules for health or drop extracts into coffee for focus, pretending it's cutting edge instead of ancient herbalism in new packaging. And in some circles, psilocybin, the hallucinogenic compound from those same sacred mushrooms, is making a comeback. Scientists now study it for treating depression and anxiety. Some call it a mental reset button. Others, cautiously, call it therapy that demands respect. Either way, we once again circling back to what shamans and priests already knew. Mushrooms change how we see the world literally and metaphorically. So let's pause here. Take a slow breath. We began with cavemen chasing strange visions under prehistoric rain and reached astronauts studying fungal life on space stations. In between, there were saints, emperors, cooks, and hippies, all united by a shared curiosity about these quiet, patient organisms that thrive where everything else decays. Mushrooms remind us of balance. They break things down, but also give life back. They connect entire forests through hidden mycelial webs, nature's own internet, long before Wi-Fi made us think we invented networks. Fungi were the first to communicate underground. We just joined the trend a few 100 million years late. If you've made it this far, congratulations. Uve officially survived. The fungal timeline, we started with cave dwellers licking random mushrooms for spiritual enlightenment, rolled through Egyptian temples, medieval bread nightmares, and French chefs with suspiciously damp basements. Now, we arrive in the modern world. Mushrooms are suddenly everywhere again. Not bad for something that was once considered the devil's snack. So, picture the early 20th century. Laboratories are buzzing, scientists are peering through microscopes, and medicine is abandoning superstition for science. Yet right there, on a forgotten petri dish, a tiny mold decides to change history. That was penicillin. Fleming discovered that it kills bacteria, and humanity basically threw fungi a parade. Suddenly, this weird life form, formerly blamed for rot and decay, became our savior. Hospitals filled with penicillin, soldiers survived infections, and doctors finally stopped prescribing leeches for everything. For the first time, fungi weren't creepy, they were noble. Then World War II ended, and humanity had one big question. What next? Well, people got curious again, but in a new, slightly reckless way. During the 1950s and 60s, Western researchers like Timothy Leary and Aldous Huxley began poking at the mind with psychedelic substances, including psilocybin from magic mushrooms. They described entire cosmic revelations, seeing patterns, colors, alternate dimensions, all from a fungus that once grew quietly under cow dung. It sounds absurd. It also kind of worked. For a brief time, psilocybin therapy was an experimental tool in psychiatry. Then, as tends to happen, things spun out of control. The counterculture movement grabbed hold of psychedelics and plastered them across festivals, art, and glowing posters. Governments panicked, bans foyed, and research froze for decades. So yes, humanity managed to rediscover the sacred mushroom, only to ban it again. Consistency was clearly not our strong point. Meanwhile, regular mushrooms, non-mystical, non-visionary, were thriving in everyday kitchens. By the 1970s, Industrial farming turned mushrooms into grocery staples. Canned button mushrooms sat beside peas, while fancy restaurants started serving truffles again to the elite. Truffles, by the way, are also fungi boot, the kind you locate with dogs or pigs, because they insist on hiding underground. People called them culinary diamonds, which makes sense considering they cost almost as much and smell faintly of wet socks. Still, rich diners loved them. Some things never change. The star of everyday cooking, though, was Agaricus bisporis, the humble white button mushroom. It's mild, affordable, and inoffensive. In a few decades, it went from royal delicacy to refrigerator default. Fungi had officially gone mainstream, but then came a quiet return of their mystical and medicinal side. In the 21st century, interest in mushrooms skyrocketed again, driven not by shamans this time, but by scientists, tech entrepreneurs, and wellness influencers. Suddenly, functional fungi became a phrase: reishi for calm, lion's mane for focus, cordyceps for energy. Basically, natural nootropics disguised as tea. Every coffee aisle started to look like a medieval apothecary. People drank mushroom lattes to feel grounded and mystical while checking emails in open-plan offices. The irony was delicious. But beneath all that trendiness, real science backed some of it. Studies showed lion's mane might help nerve growth, reishi could improve immune function, and cordyceps really does affect oxygen efficiency. Turns out, ancient medicine sometimes knew what it was doing. It just lacked peer review. Outside the wellness world, mushrooms quietly became the darlings of environmental science. Researchers discovered that fungi can break down plastics, oil, even radioactive waste. The mycelial networks, the hidden web under every forest, act like nature's recycling system, digesting death back into life. If that sounds poetic, it's because nature writes better poetry than humans do. Designers began growing furniture, packaging, even buildings out of mycelium. Bioarchitecture suddenly stopped sounding like science fiction. You could literally grow a chair. Maybe one day, apartments will self-repair like mushrooms regrowing after rain. It's hard to tell whether this is evolution or environmental desperation. Probably. But if you zoom out, though, it all fits the same grand pattern. Every era meets mushrooms in its own way. Cavemen saw visions, priests saw divinity, peasants saw danger, chemists saw medicine. Now we see sustainability and therapy. Fungi have just been patiently waiting for us to catch up, decomposing quietly while kingdoms rose and fell, waiting under leaves for humans to notice again. Even modern art and philosophy have started catching fungal fever. Mycology isn't just science anymore, it's metaphor. In books and films, the mycelium becomes a symbol of interconnection, collective consciousness, quiet cooperation instead of competition. The Avatar films echo it, novels borrow it, and environmentalists idolize it. Mushrooms have become both muse and messenger. Back in the spiritual lane, the psychedelics we once outlawed are now creeping back into medicine. Clinical trials in the United States, the UK, and Europe are testing psilocybin for depression, trauma, and addiction. Patients describe emotional clarity, not hallucinations. So here we are again, at the same ancient crossroads. Fungi as healers, fungi as guides. The scientists wear lab coats instead of headdresses, but the echoes of ritual chant faintly behind every MRI scanner. Humans seeking meaning, one mushroom at a time. Even the language overlaps. Words like ego, death, and oneness float around therapy notes the same way shamans once spoke of merging with the divine. Apparently, enlightenment is seasonal. Like wild mushrooms, let's step back one last time out of the labs, across the centuries, into the big cosmic landscape. Mushrooms were here before the first trees. Their ancestors probably helped plants colonize land. They'll likely be here long after we're gone. That's not tragic, it's oddly peaceful. You could say mushrooms are life's quiet archivists, keeping track of every birth, every decay, every return to soil. When something dies, fungi don't mourn. They get to work. Transformation is their specialty. They turn tragedy into nourishment. They recycle endings into beginnings. That might be why humans have always been drawn to them. They whisper the universal cycle. Nothing's wasted. Everything continues just in another form. Pretty comforting, if a bit damp. And now, here we are in our glowing rooms, headphones in, staring at digital screens, talking about organisms that have no internet, no eyes, no ambition, just endless patience. They remind us that meaning doesn't always come from building or owning or striving. Sometimes it comes from slow, unseen work underneath the surface. So, if you ever walk through a forest after rain and see a mushroom, pause for a bit. That's an ancient life form that taught us food, medicine, intoxication, ecology, and maybe humility. Humanity's least appreciated teacher, thriving quietly in the shade. All right? That's enough history for tonight. Close your eyes, if they're not already half. Let your thoughts drift like spores, finding their own soft soil. The world was made by strange collaborations. Stone, water, fungi, time. And tomorrow, when you wake up, remember that even the smallest, oddest things can change everything if you let them grow. Sleep well. Well, Zenobia did not start out as the kind of woman who planned to annoy an empire. But then, history rarely tells the stories of quiet women who just stayed home. She was born around the year 240 CE, somewhere in the golden dust of Palmyra city that looked like it had been built just to make travelers jealous. Palmyra was an oasis halfway between empires, rich from trade, packed with marble columns that glowed pink in sunset. Silk came through its gates from China, ivory from India, and gossip from everywhere in between. Nobody wrote down what Zenobia's childhood looked like, which is probably a scandal in itself. But the rumors were generous. Ancient writers said she spoke at least 4 or 5 languages: Greek, Aramaic, Latin, maybe Egyptian. She quoted philosophy, rode horses, hunted, and debated politics. In short, she was one of those unreasonably competent people who make everyone else look lazy. When she married Odonathus, the ruler of Palmyra, the match seemed more tactical than romantic. He was a pragmatic leader, half Roman in loyalty, totally Palmyrene in ambition. He kept Rome close enough to avoid invasion, yet distant enough to build his own empire behind their backs. Zenobia quietly learned from him. Odonathus won battles, earned favor, gathered titles. He was that rare type of man the Romans tolerated: useful, clever, not yet threatening. One day, in true ancient political fashion, he was murdered, probably by family, possibly by rivals, certainly by someone who regretted it about 5 minutes later. And just like that, Zenobia found herself a widow, a young woman with a little son, surrounded by generals twice her age, who thought they could manage her like a decorative vase. Spoiler, they could not. She stepped into power as regent for her son, Vaballathus, a name that sounds like a sneeze and spelled trouble for anyone trying to pronounce it. Zenobia took control quietly, avoiding bold declarations. No one likes a loud usurper, especially Rome. She kept the taxes flowing, the trade humming, and the city calm. But under that calm exterior, she was plotting. The Roman Empire was in one of its many midlife crises. Weak emperors came and went. Border provinces rebelled, and the map looked like someone had spilled wine over it. Rome could barely manage itself, much less a distant desert outpost. Zenobia noticed. She also noticed that none of these emperors were very good at their jobs. So she did what any practical ruler would. She took everything east of Syria and called it her own. It wasn't a dramatic rebellion at first, more like a slow territorial misunderstanding. Her generals moved into Egypt in 269 CE, politely replacing Roman officials with Palmyrene ones. A side note here, Egypt was Rome's main grain supplier. Taking it was not subtle. It was like stealing an empire's refrigerator. Still, Zenobia insisted she was loyal. Her coins even bore Emperor Aurelian's face, as if to say, "See, we're all friends here." Except her face appeared next to his, which, in political terms, was the ancient version of saying, "Actually, we own this empire now." For a while, it worked. She expanded her rule across Egypt, Syria, and parts of Anatolia. Historians count at least half a dozen regions under her control before Rome even realized what was happening, while Aurelian was busy dealing with his own internal messes. Zenobia's court, in Palmyra, became the envy of the East. Poets, philosophers, and scholars flocked to her side. She surrounded herself with educated minds, a dangerous habit for rulers. She funded Greek-style architecture, adopted regal titles, and was often referred to as Queen of the East. She didn't behave like a puppet queen or a charity widow. She mounted on horseback in armor, spoke in public, and led negotiations herself. It's said she matched her commanders stride for stride on desert campaigns. She reportedly abstained from wine, walked miles every day, and ruled with composure that unsettled her enemies. Meanwhile, Roman governors were sending increasingly panicked letters to her, asking if he noticed that half the Eastern Empire now had a different flag. He eventually did. Rome was not known for tolerating competition. Aurelian was one of those hard-nosed emperors the army respected and everyone else feared. When reports finally reached him about Zenobia's territories, he decided to deal with it personally. By then, Zenobia's empire had reached its peak, stretching from modern-day Turkey to Egypt. The trade wealth of the East flowed into Palmyra. Her palace glittered with mosaics of gods and kings. Philosophers compared her beauty to her discipline to a Roman general's. She probably heard that comparison and politely pretended not to notice the irony. When Aurelian finally marched east in 272, Zenobia prepared. She gathered her armies, fortified defenses, and even tried to make alliances with Persia. For a moment, it felt like she might actually pull it off. But Aurelian was disciplined, patient, and terrifyingly efficient. The Roman legions advanced city by city, cutting supply lines, defeating Zenobia's generals. The Battle of Yamai went badly for her, then Emasa fell, and finally, Palmyra itself was surrounded. Some sources claim she attempted to escape across the Euphrates on a camel, hoping to reach Persian allies. She nearly made it. Then Roman scouts caught her near the river. The image of a queen once ruler of half the East stopped in the desert, caught mid-flight, says more than all her battles combined. Aurelian ordered her brought before him. Ancient writers love this part. The meeting between the weary emperor and the captive queen, according to legend, she stood tall, refused to beg, and answered calmly when questioned. He accused her of rebellion. She blamed her advisors, saying she'd been misled. Aurelian pretended to accept that explanation, but he took her to Rome anyway. That might sound like mercy, but Rome never transported enemies for rehabilitation. They did it for display. What come next, her infamous parades, where legend and politics merge. When Aurelian entered Rome in triumph, Zenobia went with him. Ancient historians describe her walking ahead of the emperor's chariot, bound in golden chains, dressed in jewels so heavy she could barely stand. A quiet procession of humiliation through the streets, surrounded by Romans shouting her name. It's one of the great images of late antiquity, a queen of the desert, once seen as noble and wise, now a symbol of imperial dominance. Except, as always, reality is complicated. Some records insist she lived out her years comfortably after were granted a villa in Tibur, living as a minor noble woman, maybe marrying into Roman society. Others say she quietly faded into history, disgraced but alive. Rome, to its credit, didn't execute her. Possibly Aurelian admired her too much to destroy her, because even emperors understood that killing a legend only makes it louder. And so, Palmyra fell. Rome reasserted control. The short-lived Palmyrian Empire disintegrated like sand after rain. But while the marble arches of her city still stood centuries later, so did a story, the rare tale of a woman who challenged Rome, not out of revenge, but out of conviction that her world could stand equal. Historians often call her a rebel. Some call her ambitious. But honestly, she was just doing what emperors themselves always did, filling the gaps left by other men, and that's where many would end her story. But tonight, since we have time and candlelight to spare, let's float forward into what happened next. What became of her city, her legacy, and the strange afterlife of a fallen queen whose name refused to vanish. Because, of course, history doesn't stop when the credits roll. So, let's just pick up where everything collapsed, because collapse was kinda Rome's hobby in the 3rd century. Palmyra had fallen, Zenobia had been captured, and Emperor Aurelian was feeling very pleased with himself. But here's the thing about Rome. They loved victory almost as much as they loved performance, and Zenobia was the perfect trophy. Beautiful, intelligent, Rigucci ticked every box for propaganda. The sources disagree on what exactly happened after she was caught near the Euphrates. Some claim she was treated roughly, tied up, dragged back through her burning city. Others say Aurelian had her escorted respectfully, partly out of admiration, partly because he could already imagine her walking in his victory parade like an exotic centerpiece. Either way, she was now a captive of Rome. The journey to Rome must have been surreal. Weeks through ruined lands her armies had once ruled, passing people who either glared or quietly bowed as she was led by Roman soldiers. Every city she had claimed now announced her defeat, and every luxurious camp she had once commanded looked like a ghost of itself. By the time she reached Italy, she was more symbol than person. Poets were already writing about the proud desert queen brought low by fate. Senators whispered about her beauty. Merchants speculated whether she'd live to see her son again. Everyone had an opinion, as always, and none of them asked her. Aurelian, meanwhile, was arranging the grandest celebration Rome had seen in decades. A triumph to remind the world that Rome still mattered. After years of civil chaos, plagues, and bad emperors, he needed a display that screamed stability. Zenobia was the headline act. When the procession finally happened, it was spectacle at its most excessive. Aurelian rode in golden armor, chariot gleaming, surrounded by banners from the eastern provinces. Behind him came prisoners and treasures-laden camels carrying jewels, spices, silks, and silver statues of conquered gods. And at the very end came Zenobia. She was adorned with chains of gold, so heavy ancient writers said she occasionally stumbled under their weight. Her jewels sparkled in the sun while the crowd roared and pointed, half in awe, half in gossip. Some said she refused to weep, holding her head high throughout, like someone determined to remain queen even when conquered. The Romans adored that sort of irony. To them, it embodied victory. Aurelian smiled. The empire had its myth, revived Rome Thrumpon. Enemies humbled, order restored. But the question that lingers in history is, what happened after the parade ended? Ancient chroniclers don't agree, which usually means even they didn't know. One version claims Zenobia was executed shortly after the triumph, quietly removed once her symbolic value expired. Another, far more appealing version, says Aurelian spared her. Apparently, when he confronted her, she defended her actions eloquently, blaming her advisors, claiming she had acted in her son's name, not against Rome itself. Aurelian, impressed or perhaps simply sentimental, allowed her to live in a villa at Tiber Modern, Tiboli, to live out her years comfortably, surrounded by her surviving children. It's said she even remarried a respected Roman senator and lived as an honorary noblewoman. There's no solid proof of this, but the Romans adored tales of moral transformation. What better story than a rebel queen tamed into a Roman matron? Either way, she disappears from the record, but her city did not. Palmyra had been Rome's jewel of the desert, so Aurelian couldn't just leave it as rubble. He restored it, rebuilt temples, and stationed troops there to make sure no one else got creative with independence. The city returned to Roman hands, but its spirit, wealthy, ambitious, autonomous identity Zenobia had shaped was gone. Trade shifted elsewhere. The desert routes dried up with political tension. Palmyra survived, but never recovered its old glory. The great colonnades still stood, but now they belonged to another empire's story. That's the real tragedy. The stones survived longer than the dream behind them. And yet, somehow, Zenobia's memory refused to stay buried. Over the centuries, writers resurrected her name again and again. In the Byzantine era, she was remembered as a warning against female ambition. Those monks never missed a chance to mourn. They painted her as prideful, overreaching, destined to fall. Then, during the Renaissance, she returned as the opposite, a romantic icon, the face of lost greatness. Humanist scholars loved her intellect, her elegance, her rebellion laced with sophistication. Artists painted her gazing toward the horizon, pensive and noble, like someone regretting nothing except poor timing. Later, Enlightenment thinkers adopted her as a feminist archetype before feminism even had vocabulary. Poets and historians admired her as proof that intelligence and leadership weren't owned by men. Voltaire mentioned her approvingly, which is usually a sign you've made it into the intellectual hall of fame. By the 19th century, opera composers and playwrights were building entire productions around her. None were particularly accurate, but all were lavishly dramatic. In their imagination, Zenobia became part warrior, part saint, part tragic heroine, whichever suited the costume budget. Meanwhile, archaeologists rediscovered Palmyra's ruins, piecing together the grand colonnades and temples she had once walked through. The carved faces, inscriptions, and the desert architecture made people wonder how that distant oasis ever produced someone who dared defy Rome at its peak. Travelers describe the site as hauntingly beautiful. Giant arches half buried in dust, corridors of columns leading nowhere, carvings of long-forgotten gods resting in silence. It looked timeless, almost embarrassed to exist. Zenobia's legend flowed through all of it, drifting like desert wind through empty stones. Historians sometimes try to classify her. Was she a nationalist, an opportunist, an idealist, or just astonishingly shrewd? Probably all at once. Her rebellion wasn't just political, it was cultural. She ruled a city that was neither wholly Roman nor wholly Eastern. It was hybrid, a reflection of the Silk Road itself. She dreamed of an empire that blended civilizations instead of serving one. That subtle vision, more than her armies or jewels, is what got her crushed. Rome was never good at sharing. Even centuries later, when the Roman Empire had long evaporated, people in the Middle East still told stories about Arabic chroniclers mentioned her as Al-Zawba, the queen who built Palmyra and defied foreign kings. In folk tales, she becomes mythic, part queen, part sorceress, sometimes immortal, sometimes betrayed, always radiant. Every generation remade her in its own image. Rebels saw inspiration. Poets saw a muse. Empires saw a cautionary tale. But her city's ruins, they stayed, shimmering under desert light like bones too proud to crumble. Let's drift one step further, toward her quiet afterlife in modern times, because Zenobia didn't vanish completely when historians closed her file. When 20th century excavations began in Palmyra, Zenobia's name resurfaced everywhere from guidebooks to school history texts. Western archaeologists admired her as the Eastern Cleopatra, which is both flattering and inaccurate. Cleopatra fought for Egypt's independence, yes. But Zenobia had ruled her own empire, written her own laws, and held her own dream of balance between East and West. She was not imitating anyone. She was making her own mistake beautifully. Even into the 2000s, Palmyra remained one of the best Roman-era sites in the Middle East. Tourists walked along her colonnaded avenue, standing where Zenobia's court once paraded. Then, when conflict struck Syria, the site once again became a symbol, this time of loss and resilience. Ancient ruins don't take sides, but they do remind us what history costs. So what do we make of Zenobia? A rebel queen, a visionary, a cautionary lesson in ambition. Probably all three. She played the same imperial game as her male counterparts, only more gracefully, and with better results, if we're being honest, until luck and Rome caught up with her. But even losing didn't erase her. The irony is that the Queen of Palmyra ended up immortal not through conquest, but through defeat. Rome celebrated, crushing her. Yet it's her story, not theirs. Still retold, with fascination today. And so, when you look at those long stone colonnades under desert moonlight in Palmyra's ruins, you can almost imagine her still walking there. Head high, slow steps, quiet pride. A queen without a throne, but not without a legacy. So, the dust has long settled on the streets of Palmyra. The crowds have gone. The empire that crushed Zenobia has itself turned to ruins. Yet, somehow, her story keeps finding new audiences. That's the strange talent of certain historical figures. They refused to stay buried. While other Roman-era rulers faded into academic footnotes, Zenobia quietly evolved into something else: an icon, a mirror for whatever world chose to remember her. Let's drift through that long echo that followed her, century after century. For a while, she was a warning to the Byzantine chroniclers who wrote long after her. Zenobia symbolized female ambition gone wrong, a woman who didn't know her place. In their tales, she was too proud, too haughty, too clever. It was never her military strategy that bothered them, it was that she had dared to have one. The Byzantines were obsessed with control. Independent women in history terrified them, so they reshaped her into a morality tale. Rebel against divine order, end up in chains. Simple, neat, and very convenient for sermon writers. But history isn't good at staying simple. As centuries rolled on, new readers picked up her story and saw something different hiding underneath the Roman judgment. During the Renaissance, humanist scholars rediscovered Zenobia almost by accident. Buried in Latin chronicles and antique manuscripts, they were enchanted. She became a rare example of grace, intellect, and courage, proof that greatness didn't have to wear a beard or a laurel crown. Petrarch wrote admiringly of her. Giovanni Boccaccio, author of the Decameron, included her in his De Mulieribus Clarissa book, devoted entirely to famous women of history and myth. There she stands, between queens and warriors, treated almost like a saint of intellect and dignity. Artists soon followed. Italian painters in the 1500s loved her story. The proud queen captured, the glitter of gold chains, the soft defiance in her eyes. She became the Renaissance version of poetic justice, tragic, but artfully composed. In their portraits, she wasn't a defeated rebel. She was serene, luminous, the embodiment of noble resistance. The kind of woman who loses a kingdom but earns immortality. By the 1700s and 1800s, Zenobia experienced what we might call her celebrity phase. Europe's fascination with ancient ruins was in full bloom. Travelers explored the Middle East, sketching fallen temples in sun-bleached cities. When Europeans reached Palmyra, they were stunned. Those endless colonnades stretching across the sand looked like something out of myth. The city's rediscovery in the 18th century turned Zenobia's legend into living geography. Writers began imagining her palace, her streets, her court filled with scholars and soldiers. In England, poets wrote odes to her defiance. In France, playwrights staged tragedies named after her, where Zenobia always appeared noble, eloquent, and slightly misunderstood. Painters adored her image. She fit perfectly into the romantic obsession with doomed beauty. One famous painting shows her at the moment of her capture, head high though her wrists are bound. Another places her on a balcony overlooking the desert, the fading sun turning her kingdom gold. None of it was historically reliable, of course, but art rarely cares about accuracy. It cares about feeling, and Zenobia provided plenty of that. By the 19th century, feminism began borrowing her too. Writers and activists viewed Zenobia as an ancient symbol of female authority, the ruler who governed wisely, fought bravely, and faced defeat without compromise. Early suffragists referenced her name in essays and lectures, placing her alongside Cleopatra and Boudica as proof that leadership had no gender monopoly. Some romanticized her court as a proto-utopia of learning and culture. Others admired her courage to challenge the most powerful empire alive. Few cared whether her motives were pragmatic or poetic. It was enough that she had stood tall. It is interesting how the same woman who once symbolized female pride punished now represented female power defiant. History has a funny way of revising its morals depending on who's telling the story. Then the archaeologists arrived, literal excavators of myth. In the early 1900s, European expeditions uncovered Palmyra's ruins in greater detail. Photographs showed rows of ancient columns standing like the ribs of a sleeping giant. Inscriptions in Greek, Aramaic, and Latin revealed names, titles, and civic dedication. Some even mentioned Zenobia's ancestors, giving her legend a bit of paperwork to stand on. The ruins were everything 19th century romantics dreamed of. Tragic, majestic, haunting. Tourists later nicknamed Palmyra the Bride of the Desert. And through it all, Zenobia's name guided the fascination. She became the city's unofficial ghost. Every carved relief, every fallen statue seemed to belong to her memory. Even when archaeologists argued over dates, they all agreed the city's golden age breathed her air. By mid-century, movies and novels picked up the thread. Zenobia was recast as everything from Cleopatra's political student to a proto-feminist visionary ahead of her time. Hollywood even flirted with the idea of adapting her story, but gave up. There weren't enough explosions or convenient love triangles. Meanwhile, her real legacy, Palmyra's ruin, stood quietly, serene under Syrian skies. Through the 20th century, travelers visited those long corridors of stone, trying to imagine the moment Zenobia's soldiers marched beneath them. School children in Syria learned about her not as a defeated rebel, but as a national heroine, a symbol of independence and cultural pride. She wasn't a Roman queen in their textbooks. She was the daughter of the desert, builder of Palmyra's greatness, a ruler who dared to say no to a foreign empire. The tone had shifted again. The same rebellion Rome saw as treason became centuries later an emblem of sovereignty. That's how legacy works. It bends to whoever's standing on the ruins telling the story. Fast forward to modern times, and Zenobia's name has appeared in the strangest places. History books, certainly museums, operas, novels, but also in scientific name. Species of plants, moths, and even asteroids are named after her. She's become shorthand for beauty mixed with defiance. And then, in recent decades, Palmyra made global headlines again, this time under terrible circumstances. The city, battered by conflict, saw parts of its ancient heritage destroyed. News reports mentioned Zenobia almost like an invocation, calling back the spirit of the city's most famous queen, as though she might protect what remained. People around the world mourned, not just the ruins, but the memory they stood for. Zenobia's story, once distant, almost mythical, suddenly felt painfully current, a symbol of what is lost when power and pride collide. If you walk among the ruins now, or what's left of them, the silence feels heavy, but not hopeless. The stone pillars still stand where the desert wind allows. The carved faces still stare into eternity with mild amusement, and somewhere in those faint winds, Zenobia's story still travels, part legend, part history, completely human. Because in the end, it isn't her conquests or her fall that keep her alive. It's that quiet idea beneath it all. That one person, even in the heart of empire, can imagine a different order, can believe that intelligence and dignity might outweigh the threat of legions. And yes, she lost, but not completely. No one who earns immortality through memory truly does. The desert tends to forgive ambition more gently than history does. So maybe it's fitting that Zenobia still walks there. In the stories we retell before sleep, the queen who rose from sand defied an empire and became legend. If you close your eyes, you can almost see her silhouette framed against the last light of the setting sun. No crown, no chains, just quiet strength, the kind you can't conquer with armies. And that, perhaps, is why she lasts. Let's drift into ancient Athens. For a while, the city everyone calls the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and a suspiciously large number of naked marble statues. Athens gets romanticized a lot. Glowing white temples, wise old men debating under olive trees, crowds gathered to hear Socrates ruin someone's ego. But while all that was happening, half the population wasn't there. Literally, they weren't invited, because the democracy that invented Western civilization somehow forgot to include women in the definition of citizen. For all those glowing words about liberty and virtue, Athenian women lived within walls, real ones. Their space in society was beautifully invisible, necessary, tightly managed, and rarely discussed in polite conversation. Let us take a quiet walk through those walls and see what daily life looked like for them. First thing to understand, Athens liked to talk about ideals. Philosophers spoke endlessly about virtue, the soul, justice, and freedom. But those were generally topics for men who owned property and wore sandals dramatically. Athenian women, meanwhile, were assigned a simpler moral program: obedience, modesty, and producing legitimate heirs. That's it. Their legal status was that of a perpetual minor. A woman could not vote, own property independently, sign contracts, represent herself in court, or even attend most public events. Instead, she lived under the guardianship, called a kyrios of her closest male relative, first her father, then her husband, then, if necessary, her sons. Basically, there was always a man holding the metaphorical paperwork of her existence. Athens saw this as moral order. They even framed it philosophically. Socrates and Aristotle both had things to say about women, and none of them were remotely flattering. Aristotle, the eternal, wrote that women were incomplete males, which probably explains why his wife used his absence to run their household like a quiet empire. Still, this warped logic shaped everything. Athenian society was built on male citizenship, the belief that only men could possess reason enough to guide the city. Women's domain was the household oikos, the invisible engine of family, labor, and reputation. And that's where we'll spend most of our time, because within those walls, the so-called private life wasn't any freer. A Greek house, at least for the wealthy, was divided into two distinct zones, one for men, one for women. The women's area, called the gynaikonitis, was usually a separate courtyard or upper floor. It was meant for spinning, weaving, managing servants, and maintaining silence. Privacy and control went hand in hand. Athenian wives were expected to avoid strangers, avoid the marketplace, and generally not exist in the public imagination. Even their names were rarely spoken in public. You know those speeches in Athenian courts where men brag about their reputations? They refer to their wives indirectly as the mother of my children. That level of anonymity was considered respectful. So what did a typical day look like? Morning might begin with light household chores, organizing servants, preparing wool for weaving, managing the day is a food. They might have checked on children, made offerings to household gods, and then spent hours spinning yarn. It wasn't glamorous, but weaving was not just a task, it was a moral metaphor. A good wife, like a good weaver, kept order by turning loose threads into pattern. In households without servants, women worked side by side with their daughters. Those from poorer families might even sell fabric, bread, or small crafts in local markets. The ideal of isolation was mostly for the upper classes. Poverty had fewer moral opinions. Marriage came early. Girls were married around 14 or 15 to men, twice their age. The match was usually arranged by fathers negotiating dowries, money or property given to the husband as financial insurance. The wedding day itself was highly symbolic. Torches, feasts, and a public parade from the girl's childhood home to her new one, as though transferring ownership of a prized heirloom. Romance wasn't part of the formula. Obedience was. A respectable wife was expected to avoid gossip, keep her gaze lowered, and above all, produce male heirs. Love might come thereafter. Trust, routine, and resignation had been carefully woven together. To outsiders, this might sound bleak, but to Athenians, this was ordered, the structure that kept chaos out. Still, not every woman lived quietly inside those walls. Let's float over to another social category entirely. The hetairai, or courtesans. Unlike the secluded wives, hetairai were educated, conversational, and openly visible in society. They attended symposium and drinking parties forbidden to respectable wives and engaged in witty debates with philosophers and politicians. One famous hetaira was Aspasia of Miletus, the partner of Pericles, the man who basically built the Acropolis. She taught rhetoric, hosted salons, and allegedly advised Pericles on political speeches, though her brilliance scandalized Athens more than her relationship did. The existence of Hittite creates a strange contrast. Athens expected virtue from its wives, but intellect from its courtesans. The city divided femininity into two categories, private virtue and public talent, and made sure they never overlapped. So, ironically, the most influential women in Athenian politics weren't citizens at all. They existed outside of legal respectability, but inside cultural fascination. Now, let us drift back into the home again, where childbirth and family life dominated a woman's identity. Greek religion had gods for just about everything, including Hera and Artemis, protectors of childbirth. But divine help didn't make labor easier. Childbirth was dangerous. Midwives were common, and infant mortality exceptionally high. Surviving both labor and reputation was an achievement. Male children were celebrated. Female births received polite indifference. Fathers decided whether a newborn would be raised or exposed, euphemism for leaving unwanted infants to die or be taken as slaves. For those who survived, education reflected gender. Boys learned rhetoric and politics. Girls learned weaving, managing supplies, and piety. Still, fragments of letters and inscriptions hint at curiosity and quiet intelligence among Athenian women. They may not have attended school, but they were rarely ignorant. Religion, oddly enough, offered one of the few public escapes from domestic seclusion. Athenian women could participate in certain festivals, particularly those dedicated to female deities. The Thesmophoria, honoring Demeter and Persephone, was one such event. For 3 days, married women gathered outside the city, Hawaii from men performing rituals that symbolized fertility and renewal. It was part religious devotion, part collective exhale. For once, they could move freely, speak loudly, and eat what they wanted. Aristophanes, always the snarky playwright, even built a comedy around this festival where men disguised themselves to spy on women's secret rites, mostly to mock their supposed plotting. But in reality, it shows how these gatherings were both sacred and slightly terrifying to male imagination. Other festivals, like the Erephria or the Panathenea, gave younger girls small ceremonial roles, carrying offerings or weaving garments for Athena. It was religion disguised as civic training, polite rehearsal for obedience and purity. Still, attending rituals, walking through sanctuaries, and standing among other women must have felt like freedom measured in heartbeats. And let's talk about beauty, because every culture has opinions on that. For Athenian women, beauty ideally meant modesty. Pale skin was desirable, not because of fashion, but because it showed you never worked outdoors. Wealthier women powdered their faces with lead-based pigments which, yes, was slowly poisonous. But fashion rarely consults medicine. Their wardrobes were practical yet elegant linen and wool garments draped in folds, fastened with pins. Jewelry was modest indoors, but glorious during festivals. Gold earrings, bracelets, and hair ornaments were less about vanity than status. Public statues of women followed the same paradox. The sculpted figures in Athens look graceful, yes, but most represent goddesses or priestesses, not ordinary citizens. Real Athenian women were rarely sculpted at all. Immortality in marble was for men who debated in the agora, not for the women who kept those marble men fed and clothed. Death, ironically, gave Athenian women more public acknowledgement than life did. They managed funeral rituals, washed and adorned the bodies, mourned in procession, and maintained the family gravesite tasks, both sacred and emotional. Memorial stones sometimes depict women seated, receiving farewells from family members. That quiet, dignity, hands clasped. Faces come says more about their lives than most texts ever do. And in epitaphs, their virtues repeat like a mantra: modest, faithful, managing the household well. No mention of intellect or wit, though you sense both lurking in the silence between words. So by now, you might be wondering, did anyone think this situation was unfair? Not really. At least, not by Athenian standards. Plato toyed with the idea of equality in his Republic, suggesting women could share in education and even warrior training. But even he framed it like a philosophical thought experiment rather than an actual reform. His fellow citizens preferred the old ways, the ones that kept households orderly and men unchallenged. Athens wasn't built to question gender hierarchy. It was built to sustain reputation, inheritance, and continuity. Women existed quietly to keep that system turning. Still, if you look carefully, a subtler story emerges of endurance, shared wisdom, and resilience wrapped in silence. These women ran households, shaped rituals, raised future citizens, and managed economies under mountains of decorum. Their world was invisible, but it knitted the visible one together. That's the irony of Athens. Democracy on the streets, monarchy at home. Let's drift further beyond those Athenian courtyard walls, ones lined with spinning wheels, looms, and polite silence, because outside them existed an entire tier of women who lived closer to daylight. Some may be choice, some by necessity, and some because society had simply pushed them there. If traditional Athenian women were expected to stay hidden, these were the women everyone saw. The traders, the slaves, the foreigners, the entertainers, and the priestesses, each carving out fragments of identity on the edges of a city that claimed to be civilized, yet couldn't quite handle equality. Their stories, scattered through fragments of pottery, comedy, and court speeches, show how flexible Athenian morality could be when profit, utility, or ritual came into play. Let's start with slaves. In Athens, slavery was not a moral debate. It was an accepted fact. Almost every household owned at least one. A larger home could have dozens, running everything from cooking and weaving to childcare and escorting their mistresses outside. Female slaves lived multitasking lives. They worked household chores, spun wool, fetched water from public fountains, and sometimes assisted their mistresses during childbirth. In wealthier homes, a slave might act as a pedagoga caretaker for the children, shaping their manners more than their parents probably realized. Their lives were exhausting. They could be sold, punished, or abused without legal recourse. Their bodies were at the mercy of the household's male members. Their children belonged not to them, but to whoever owned them. Yet historians occasionally find strange, gentle records buried in court testimony masters, freeing loyal household slaves, mistresses entrusting them with keys or burial rights, moments of mutual reliance within uneven worlds. Athens didn't treat its slaves as people, but within that cruelty, tiny patterns of human connection still flickered. Then there were the Metic women, the foreigners who somehow ended up in Athens, whether through trade, family, or sheer stubbornness. They had the rare freedom of visibility, but none of the protection of citizenship. Metic women could run businesses, own property, and live more openly than Athenian wives. They managed taverns, sold perfumes, wove garments for temples, and served as midwives or musicians. They paid special residence taxes and were legally bound to a male patron prostates. But unlike local women, they walked the agora, argued over prices, and interacted with strangers. Athens, for all its obsession with purity and lineage, still relied heavily on these outsiders for its commercial heartbeat. So, while Athenian men philosophized about reason and virtue, foreign women were quietly keeping the economy alive, one thread, coin, and jug of olive oil at a time. The irony wasn't lost on history. Now, about those Hetairai Agenbi, because they were the dazzling exception that Athens could neither ignore nor properly categorize. Where a respectable wife was expected to be silent, a Hetaira was expected to speak and be clever, and keep powerful men entertained without making them feel ridiculous in art form. Really, centuries before diplomacy existed, they weren't prostitutes in the casual sense. The word Hetaira translates roughly to companion. They were educated in conversation, music, and philosophy. Some were foreign-born or freed slaves who reinvented themselves with wit and strategy. At symposia, those famous Athenian drinking parties, Hetairae, reclined beside men, played the lyre, argued about poetry, and occasionally delivered better political insights than the guests who were supposedly in charge. Aspasia, the most famous of them all, kept company with Pericles, architect of Athens' golden age. Her house was said to host thinkers like Socrates and She was blamed for influencing state policy, which, knowing Greek politicians, probably just meant they didn't like the idea of a woman being smarter than them. Comic playwrights tore her apart on stage because that's what ancient Athenians did when faced with brilliance wrapped in scandal. But under the mockery, she remained untouchable. Even in satire, Aspasia commanded fascination. There's something quietly satisfying about that. Still, not all women who lived public lives did so elegantly. The line between survival and shame was razor. Beneath the celebrated Hetairai existed hundreds of poorer sex workers registered in city brothels. Solon, the reforming lawgiver creditor, philosopher, self-declared moralist, was, ironically, the one who legalized brothels. He framed it as a civic good. Better to have organized lust than chaos, he supposedly said, which is a creative way of justifying hypocrisy. Brothels were cheap, state-controlled, and heavily taxed. Most women working there were slaves, given no choice in their labor. They were kept apart from respectable society, though society eagerly used their existence as a moral safety valve. You could almost say Athens built its public order on invisible women at every level: wives preserving lineage, slaves maintaining survival, courtesans managing emotion, and prostitutes absorbing everyone else is a contradiction. Everyone had their designated function in the moral machinery of democracy. Equality never even made the blueprints. Let's wander briefly into the temples, wherefore once women held actual power. Religion was one of the only institutions that allowed female leadership. Priestesses oversaw rituals, sacrifices, and festivals. They were chosen for status, piety, or family lineage, and their positions brought both wealth and prestige. The priestess of Athena Polias, for example, was a public figure with influence second only to the state's leading officials. People consulted her on omens, births, and decisions. When the Athenians debated rebuilding the Parthenon, guess whose voice carried divine weight? Hers. These women weren't hidden or silenced. They performed before crowds, conducted ceremonies, and handled sacred finances. Their authority flowed from religion rather than politics. But power is power whether it wears robes or armor. Temple sanctuaries also provided pockets of sanctuary for vulnerable women, young girls, dedicated to service before marriage, widows seeking refuge, or those fleeing domestic abuse. In silence, religion often filled the gaps the legal system refused to see. Of course, Athens being Athens, all this spiritual importance came wrapped neatly in contradiction. Female priesthoods existed to honor female gods: Athena, Artemis, Demeter, but every major philosophical school still argued that women were morally inferior. So while women were burning incense to wisdom itself, the men outside were writing treatises about why they couldn't reason. If irony were currency, ancient Athens would still be rich. Now, look at what passes for freedom across these divisions. A respectable wife had safety, but invisibility. A medic woman had visibility, but dependence. A slave had purpose, without identity. A hetaira had status without respectability. For each agency existed only as a narrow doorway, one you had to walk through quietly or risk everything. And yet, through fragments, you see glimpses of humor, tenderness, and protest. There's a fragment of poetry by a woman named Irina, mourning her childhood friend. There's a funerary stele showing a woman offering jewelry to her servant with genuine affection. There's a vase painting of two women exchanging a knowing smile. These aren't grand moments, but they hum with life. For all their constraints, Athenian women somehow cultivated grace and limited space. Their rebellion was simply existing thoughtfully. Meanwhile, men were debating whether women had souls equivalent to men's. Plato thought maybe. Aristotle said no. The Stoics nodded vaguely and changed the subject. It is remarkable how centuries of philosophy managed to produce entire treatises about justice while pretending half the population didn't count. But those invisible lives didn't vanish. They left traces in pottery shards, in fragments of hymns, in scratched graffiti praying to goddesses for small mercy. Those scratches speak louder than marble statues now. So yes, Athens built democracy, but like its Parthenon, it stood on uneven ground. Beneath it, dazzling speeches and public virtue was an entire underworld of labor and loyalty that kept things running. That's the quiet foundation of the Athenian miracle. Behind every philosopher polishing an argument was a woman mending his tunic. Behind every general marching to war was a wife calculating ration jars. Behind every festival was a network of women burning candles to gods of fertility, hoping the city remembered them, even if history never would. And just before we leave this era drifting behind, let us dim the lights a little more, 'cause the third and last part isn't about daily life anymore. It's about perception, the myth versus the truth. How later civilizations took these same Athenian women, remade them in marble, and called them ideals even, though the real women behind them were still locked away in quiet rooms, living their brief lives between shadows and sunlight. Let's drift there next. Let's stay a little longer in ancient Athens. But now the city has turned quiet, more memory than place. The white marble glows under late light. The crowds are gone, and all that remains is the soft hum of stories buried too long. Because what truly survives of classical Athens isn't its speeches or statues. It's the echo of people who were rarely mentioned, but always present. The women who made dinner while philosophers made arguments. The mothers who taught their sons to speak before those sons stood in assemblies, declaring that women had no voice. History forgot them officially, but it golden tea erased them completely. Let's walk among those quiet ghosts for a bit. Athens called itself the cradle of reason. Lobely slogan less accurate if you were a woman trying to cross the street. Respectable wives lived in guarded houses. Poorer women worked openly, but carried social stigma. The entire city balanced on invisible labor performed by people whose names never made it into history. Yet, when archaeologists began excavating centuries later, what did they find? Not just marble temples, but perfume jars, hairpins, loom weights, children's toys, and clay figurines left at altars. Those tiny things told an entirely different story, a private civilization hidden under the official one. That's the world historians now call the domestic sphere, which sounds polite enough, but really means the everything else that kept Athens running. Consider this: during the great political assemblies where men debated justice and virtue, someone still had to bake the bread, fetch the water, and make sure the hearth didn't go out. The democracy applauded freedom, while fully depending on unfree labor. Someone always had to stay home to keep that illusion tidy. Women of Athens became experts in invisibility. They mastered subtle authority, instructing servants, negotiating trades quietly, arranging marriages, managing dowries, and mourning the dead in long, ritual precision. Their order maintained the city's order. Plato might have complained about human imperfection. Athenian women handled it 3 times daily before midday, and when danger came, wars, plagues, fires, it wasn't philosophers who held families together. It was the women who'd been trained all their lives to endure silently. Athens did not write that down, but endurance has its own kind of immortality. Now, think of the irony. The same society that claimed women lacked reason filled its religion with goddesses Athena, Hera, Artemis, Demeter, each embodying wisdom, power, or protection. The city was literally named after a woman deity, yet real women could not enter politics or watch plays freely. Every time an Athenian prayed to Athena, he was appealing to the transcendence of female intelligence while denying it at home. If hypocrisy had an address, it might have been the Acropolis. Still, even through that hypocrisy, women carved small sanctuaries of expression. At festivals, they danced, sang, and performed rituals that openly celebrated fertility, renewal, and memory. The Thesmophoria gave them days away from domestic rules, a strange form of freedom contained in religion. Those moments were tiny fractures in the wall. You can almost imagine their laughter carrying across the night, slipping through the cracks in respectability like candlelight leaking down from a shuttered window. Athens may have ignored female voices in public, but privately, women wrote the emotional language of the citiettes. Stories of love, loss, patience, grief. When young Athenian men quoted Homer, those boys were raised by women who probably recited the verses before they could read them. They didn't write epics, but they taught every future reader how to listen to one. Centuries later, when artists and philosophers in modern Europe began idealizing ancient Greece, they reconstructed Athens out of polished stone and selective morals. They painted noble women in soft lighting, graceful, obedient, tragic. The stereotype of the classical woman was born. Beautiful, pure, passive. The mythmakers used her as decoration for the glory of men's achievements, never realizing they were repeating exactly what Athens had done. The Parthenon became the model of perfect architecture, and its sculptures became metaphors for virtue. But again, marble smooths out too much. The real Athens was noisy, complicated, full of dust, laughter, and contradiction. It wasn't a temple of perfection, it was a city built on compromises, and the women kept that compromise alive long after everyone else forgot. Today, when tourists wander through those same ruins, Few notice that nearly all inscriptions with women's names belong to priestesses or tombs. Either sacred or dead, those were the two socially safe ways to exist in public memory. Yet their presence is persistent. You can walk through the agora without realizing that every so-called male achievement was supported by an unseen network of female labor. Philosophers needed clean tunics. Scribes needed prepared food. Sculptors needed someone to fetch water for the clay. Every great mind was quietly assisted by hands history refused to name. Athens never built monuments for them. But the women didn't need marbling. They had continuity. Their lives turned into the rituals mothers taught daughters for centuries: how to weave cloth, how to cook lentils in terracotta pots, how to make household offerings. Those were acts of survival, disguised as tradition. And tradition usually lasts longer than democracy. When you think of Athens now, you think of logic, the birth of philosophy, and bold civic ideals. But maybe the truer measure of its civilization lies not in what it said, but in what it withheld. The women who lived between those unspoken lines gave the concept of endurance its vocabulary. They taught restraint, grace, and quiet intelligence long before those became virtues written into moral codes. Their world might look small to us, but from that smallness grew the rhythms that later Europe, Rome, and even modern societies borrowed when defining family, morality, and culture. They weren't citizens of their time, but they were citizens of history. So what was life like for women in classical Athens? It was ordinary and exhausting, limited yet meaningful. It was a life built around repetition, but through repetition came stability. A world of careful footsteps, whispered advice, and endurance that somehow transcended its own silence. While their husbands debated logic, Athenian women mastered the art of surviving a system designed to forget. They mend wearily, they won. Because while Athens eventually fell, their quiet methods, order, patience, domestic strategy outlived the empire itself. That's their legacy. Next time you see a photo of the Parthenon glowing under sunset, remember that its perfection is an illusion shaped by thousands of invisible labors. Someone wove its workers' clothes, ground their grain, tended their households, and prayed for their safe return. All those invisible women left fingerprints across the stones of history, faint but indelible. They built nothing monumental, yet they kept civilization functioning through centuries that called them irrelevant. Every democracy stands, in some strange way, on their unseen steadiness. So maybe freedom, even back then, didn't begin with debate or marble temples. Maybe it began with women spinning quietly in shadowed courtyards, creating the fabric that held the whole city together thread by thread. And from those threads, history kept weaving. Let's wander into Rome for a while back when it was noisy, smoky, and just faintly every street corner had something to say. Literally, the walls were covered, from marble houses to city latrines. Words everywhere. Jokes, insults, prayers, poetry, debts. You could say the Romans invented the social media feed. They just carved it into stone instead of doom-scrolling it. And honestly, that's what Roman graffiti was. Ordinary people trying to leave a piece of themselves behind. The empire might have worshipped emperors and gods, but its real heartbeat lives in scratched messages, quick thoughts left by slaves, lovers, soldiers, and people who had no idea tourists would one day read them in museums. When we talk about Rome, we usually talk about marble, heroes, senators, generals. But tonight, Ella talk about the messy underlay era, the graffiti, that peeks out like ink beneath the veneer of civilization. Because those scratches tell us the truth about real Romans. Loud, clever, vulgar, emotional, and deeply human. Pompeii is where most of those voices survived. You already know how it ended, buried by Mount Vesuvius, sealed under ash like time hit pause. But before it happened, people wrote their hearts out. And their jokes, and their complaints about bar service. Every wall became a canvas. The graffiti of Pompeii covers everything. Taverns, bathhouses, brothels, temples, even people's living rooms. They wrote in charcoal, scratched with nails, or smeared with red paint. Most were anonymous. A few signed their masterpieces proudly. Let's start with the classics. One famous line reads, We two dear men, friends forever, we're here. If you want to know our names, they're Gaius and Aulus. That's it. Nothing profound, just immortality via bathroom wall. Another confessed-or-I wonder wall. That you haven't collapsed, since you bear the tedious scribblings of so many men. A little self-aware sarcasm, 2,000 years before the internet figured out irony. Much of the graffiti was about love or whatever passed for love after several drinks. There's a pattern. Declarations, apologies, jealous jabs. The Roman heart was apparently equal parts dramatic and bad at commitment. One man wrote, "Success is the weaver, loves Iris, who does not care for him." Brutal honesty. Another scribbled a warning. Lovers, like bees, lead a honeyed life, but soon they vanish. Imagine writing your heartbreak on a wall for the whole city to judge. Actually, that's still the internet, isn't it? In some cases, though, the lines get strangely poetic. A graffito on a doorway reads, "Let whoever loves prosper, let whoever doesn't perish." It's both blessing and curse, in one neat, curse-like blessing. Romans clearly didn't do subtle. They also didn't do censorship. If you think ancient people were all reserved and noble, Roman graffiti will disillusion you fast. The city walls were basically an ongoing talent show of obscenity. There are anatomically specific sketches, sentences you could never print on a family-friendly translation, and the occasional insult that really shows artistic flair. For example, Lucius pinched my girlfriend, watch her back. Or one glorious complaint, Apollinaris, Doctor, to the Emperor Titus, defecated well here. The pride in that sentence deserves an award. Romans were equal opportunity mockers. They teased local politicians, insulted rivals, even used walls as long-form revenge posts. You find endless equations of so-and-so is a thief, or Marcus owes me 7 coins, often combined with artistic doodles of questionable anatomy. In short, if the gods were looking down, they probably learned some new vocabulary, but it wasn't all tavern humor. Some graffiti is hauntingly delicate, true whispers of personality in a world usually flattened by history. In one house someone wrote, "Health to all who love, and may they perish who do not." Another, perhaps a broken soul, carved simply, "I have spoken." No name, no explanation, just that like they needed to leave proof of existence. The mix of tones is striking. An empire that built aqueducts and amphitheaters also filled its walls with petty gossip, cosmic loneliness, and crude drawings. Every scratch was a rebellion against silence, and there were practical messages, 2 directions, prices, schedules. At Nuceria, there will be games with wild beasts and hunting shows. A copper pot was lost from this shop. Whoever returns, it shall be rewarded with 65 coins. Bureaucracy met humanity. Graffiti even worked as political campaigning. Candidates for office aediles duumviri, endless Latin titles hired teams to paint endorsements, vote for Lucius Papedius, Sabinus, a fine man. And rivals would sometimes add responses beneath, like Sabinus Sux. Democracy in chalk. Women's voices appear here too, surprisingly often and remarkably candid. In a brothel in Pompeii, one inscription reads, "Myrtis was here. I satisfied many men." Another, defiantly simple, "Atamitas loves Hedia." The walls in women's quarters and streets show gossip, laughter, and the kind of humor domestic society tried to suppress. One woman scrawled, "Choose, be kind. You've been gone too long." The heartbreak behind those 5 words feels as fresh as any text message left unread. It's strange. The men of Rome delivered grand speeches in marble forums. The women carved their truths on plaster. Only one of those has aged honestly. Then there are the schoolboys, sparkling future senators practicing alphabets, doodling animals, quoting poets. You can still read their shaky exercises lines of poetry, cope it again and again, sometimes dissolving into nonsense midway through when boredom set in. One line reads, "Oh wall, I am surprised you're not tired, taking the weight of so much scribbling." Maybe one of them grew up to write satire, maybe another became the bureaucrat, erasing graffiti for a living. Life has a way of looping like that. The religion of graffiti is fascinating too. Apart from gossip and ego, people carved prayers to Venus, Mercury, and Fortuna, often hoping to secure love, luck, or revenge. Some were transactional. Venus, grant my wish, and I'll hang up this cloak to you. Others sounded like threats. Mercury, punish him who stole my sandals. Even in devotion, the Romans negotiated. They spoke to their gods like disgruntled customers, which, to be fair, explains a lot about their empire. What makes these words powerful isn't their elegance, but their order. History records Emperors Augustus, Nero, Claudius, but graffiti remembers the people who paid taxes to them, cursed them, or ignored them completely. A graffito from Herculaneum reads, "There is nothing more foolish than loving too deeply." Another says, "All who love, may you fare well. I am going. Farewell." It's humanity on pause, the emotional remains of ordinary people caught between eternity and a volcano. Even the jokes become poignant once you remember that everyone who wrote them died within hours, when Vesuvius erupted or laughter turned fossil. Their words outlived them. It's almost eerie reading them now. We expect grandeur from history, not bathroom humor or heartbreak, but maybe this is what memory really looks like. Not heroic speeches, but small sentences that survived by accident. And that's only the first layer. Because graffiti didn't just talk about love and laughter, it carried social maps. You can trace class, gender, and power through what people dared to write. Upper-class Romans commissioned marbled it. Lower-class workers scratched graffiti. But on the walls, the hierarchy vanished. The baker's apprentice insulted senators. Slaves praised their lovers. Freedmen declared new status in rough Latin. The walls were briefly equalizers, no senators to censor, no scribes to correct grammar. Graffiti democratized memory. Every sentence, even the vulgar ones, said, "I existed." And somewhere between the laughter, prayers, and anatomy lessons, you realize these marks were never really for the future. They weren't planned for preservation. They were impulsivremen id, left raw in plaster. That's what makes them so alive. Even emperors couldn't control what the streets said about them. Julius Caesar could command legions, but couldn't erase a bad drawing behind a tavern. Nero could burn half the city, but not the caricatures that mocked his singing. That small defiance makes Roman graffiti oddly timeless. We still do the same, only now with keyboards instead of brushes, screens instead of walls. Let's float ahead for a moment. When archaeologists first saw the graffiti of Pompeii in the 18th century, they were scandalized. Museums refused to show the more explicit pieces in public. For decades, those artifacts were locked in secret cabinets, available only to scholars or, more realistically, curious gentlemen pretending to be scholars. The Victorians liked their Romans noble. The real ones, it tournedat, were crude, funny, and surprisingly familiar. That discovery, funny little inscriptions frozen under Asherute, what history could sound like. It stopped being just about great men. It started including everyone who ever picked up a piece of charcoal and decided the world needed to know what they were thinking. Even if what they were thinking was just, Gaius was here, and he had a good time. We'll linger longer in those ruins soon, because the next stretch of wall, the next part of the tale, shows how graffiti evolved from chatter into code, symbols, meanings, and private jokes that turned ordinary scribbles into hidden messages about power, sex, and rebellion. Because Rome's walls didn't just talk. Sometimes they whispered. Let's step a little deeper into those Roman streets. You can almost hear it, the murmur of tavern laughter, sandals on cobblestones, the clink of amph, and somewhere in the background, a faint, scraping sound. Someone, somewhere, is writing again. Another name, another insult, another prayer. At first glance, graffiti in ancient Rome looks chaotic. Random words, random hands, random walls. But if you squint a little, or better, listen carefully, it starts to reveal patterns. Hidden messages, inside jokes, underground politics, even small acts of defiance. Because writing on walls wasn't just about boredom, it was about being seen in a world designed to ignore you. Rome, for all its power, was obsessed with control. Speech, religion, loyalties, they all came with boundaries. There were official inscriptions, carved by slaves and signed by senators in perfect Latin, meant to last forever. And then there were the walls, where everyone else got to speak, unsupervised. That alone made graffiti its own quiet revolution. The empire could dictate law, but it couldn't stop a brick from talking back. Take the Palatine Hill, the neighborhood of emperors. In the 3rd century CE, archaeologists discovered a strange sketch carved into a plaster wall near the imperial barracks. It shows a crucified figure with the head of a donkey, and beneath it, a figure worshipping. The scrolled caption reads, "Alexamenos worships his god." That one line is one of the earliest known images mocking Christians. It's half joke, half propaganda. Imagine being Alexamenos, whispering your prayers in secret, only to find your faith immortalized as graffiti mockery. The empire's cruelty was sometimes written small, and yet, right beside it, someone else scratched back another line. Alexamenos faithful. A response. A defense. Two faint writings on a wall. Two opposing sides of an ancient argument. Letters turned to battleground human faith and mockery, fighting silently through thin layers of plaster. That's part of what makes graffiti fascinating. It's not just what was written, but who dared to write it. The literacy rate in the Roman world varied wildly. Most of the elite read and wrote easily. Many commoners couldn't. So the existence of graffiti-thousands upon thousands of lines in clumsy handwriting tells us literacy wasn't just for philosophers. People learned letters for work, religion, trade, and gossip. You find slaves who could write complete sentences, merchants quoting poets, barmaids who knew enough grammar to mock their clients. Graffiti turned writing into everyone's language. Rome never planned for that. It just happened. And that's where hidden meaning often began, not in fancy cryptography, but in mischief and survival. In Pompeii, elections gave rise to coded endorsements. The official murals shouting, "Vote for Marcus Hulk," stood tall in paint. But beneath them, faint etchings traded side common-sparity slogans, teasing rivals, abbreviations that made sense only to locals. You might see VAF repeatedly scratched near campaign slogans. Scholars debate it, but the consensus is grimly funny. It probably stood for Velia Zin Aeternum Frater. Go to hell, brother! The Romans, it turns out, invented the other symbols crept in, too. Phalluses drawn with gusto-marked bakeries, bathhouses, or sometimes directions to brothels. A good graffiti artist could turn obscene shapes into directional maps. To the Romans, erotic humor was public language half art, half compass. But those same drawings could carry coded prayers. A crude phallus etched near a doorway might have meant protection from the evil eye, not just neighborhood mischief. To curse, or bless, looked visually the same. Every rude scrawl had double meaning, depending on who was laughing. And then came the poets, the graffiti romantics, who turned alleyways into one of the most mysterious pieces from Pompeii reads, "You love, I don't love. Why? Perhaps you love Hesychus, the mirror of your eyes, as I love you." It's baffling, half poem, half argument, tangled in translation, but written by someone desperate to be heard. In another house, someone quoted Virgil, slightly wrong but charmingly so. "Love conquers all. May we all yield to love." The kind of sentiment that would make a poet proud, even if the spelling wobbled. Quoting high art on low walls made its own statement. You didn't have to host a symposium to claim culture. You could just carve it near a bakery. Sometimes these fragments read like coded conversations. One person writes, "Admetus was here." Another scribbles beneath, "If you were so great, you'd write in Greek." The back and forth continues. Admetus doesn't speak Greek. He speaks the truth. A tiny duel in graffiti form sharp, petty, and deeply Roman. Of course, graffiti could be dangerous too. Some pieces hint at politics more brazenly than the empire liked. A wall in Rome was found with scratched phrases mocking Nero. Nero plays the lyre while the city burns. Someone risked imperial punishment just to put that into public view. Others expressed bitterness toward taxes or military service. May the gods destroy the recruiters. One soldier wrote, clearly having a bad day. Bread is smaller, but taxes are higher, complained another. Every wall turned into a whisper network, scattered evidence of discontent that official historians ignored. And in that sense, graffiti became democratic truth. The Senate could record victories in marble, but only graffiti captured frustration, flirting, or fatalism. Moving through time, you see a language evolving. Humor, sarcasm, slang. Pompeii's walls grow more personal the closer you read them. In the brothel district, lines range from Fortunata wrote this to Gaius loves women. All of them. Blunt, yes. But one graffiti says simply, Samias to restituta, goodbye. Nothing else, just farewell. Maybe a breakup, maybe a death. Then another scroll appears near a doorway. Restituta was here. Maybe it's the same one. Maybe not. The imagination fills the blank space that history leaves behind. Reading those lines feels almost voyeuristic, like opening a tablet left mid. The people behind them couldn't have imagined archaeologists would one day catalog every letter. They were talking to their own world, not ours. And yet, here we are, eavesdropping across centuries. Graffiti also played with social boundaries. Take trade, guildspakers, builders, gladiators. They left marks to crude drawings of tools or gladiatorial names. In a tavern near the amphitheater, one spectator wrote, Celadis, the threx makes the girls sigh. Another counters below, Crescens, the net fighter makes them faint. Clearly, Rome invented fan wars long before television. It wasn't purely entertainment, though athletes and fighters used graffiti to echo statista, only fame open to men who weren't noble. The walls served the same emotional purpose as a fan page, proof someone mattered. Even slaves used it to mark survival. One graffiti fragment reads, Service wrote this before dawn. You can picture him pausing from chores, stealing a moment to carve his name in the soft plaster, claiming a forward eternity. Of all the graffiti themes, love remains the loudest, and sometimes it turns unexpectedly coded. Certain words appear repeated Legree hearts scratched into Latin walls, secret phrases denoting same-sex affection or forbidden intimacy. Felix loves Marcellus. Eutyches kissed Tyches. Menaphila loves Xanthus forever. They weren't subtle, but they weren't public announcements either. Society often pretended such things didn't happen. Yet here they were etched alongside prayers, insults, and declarations of lust. Rome's private walls were quietly freer than its public laws. The best part, though, is that graffiti mixed all of this love, hate, poetry, politics, without caring about consistency. The same wall might hold a prayer beside a joke about bad wine. The same handwriting might praise a goddess, then insult the local baker. It's history without editing, without virtue signaling. Just raw humanity. For every elegant inscription in stone, demanding glory to the emperor, there's a scratched counterpoint nearby. Someone fed up, flirtatious, or half-drunk. And honestly, that's probably closer to reality than all the marble speeches combined. What remains remarkable is how modern it all feels. A wall full of anonymous voices, arguing, confessing, joking, conspiring. Doesn't that sound like a comment section? The handwriting might have changed, but the impulse never did. Human beings always find a surface to talk to, even if no one's listening. Rome's forums may have collapsed, but its walls never stopped speaking. They carry the most ancient version of what we still crave today. To be read, to be remembered, even for one short sentence that survives the wind. Let's drift one last time through those fading inscriptions, because the final part of this story is about afterlives, the rediscovery of those walls. The scholars who blushed translating them, and the way Roman graffiti somehow became a reflection of ourselves, chaotic, funny, tender, imperfect, and enduring. The empire is gone, but its doodles linger. The ashes of Vesuvius preserve not just art or architecture, but the whisper of every bored and brilliant human who couldn't help. But right I was here. Let's pause for a moment, because by now, the streets of Pompeii have gone cold. The chatter quieted almost 2,000 years ago, sealed in a single day of fire and ash. But weirdly enough, that very disaster saved every laugh, curse, and confession. It turned chaos into archive. The graffiti buried under Vesuvius became something no Roman planned. Eternity. When archaeologists started digging in the 18th century, it wasn't the amphitheater or the temples that first shocked them, it was the writing. Thousands of messages still visible, still legible, still indecently human. Suddenly, the ancient world could talk again. Not emperors this time, but people ordinary enough to be forgotten. Back then, antiquarians, those first-generation history collectors, had a sentimental idea of Rome. They expected noble Latin verses and majestic inscriptions. Instead, they got walls shouting things like, "Theophilus, don't touch my girl, and I broke up with you because you never brought wine." It was as if the marble statue of Caesar had been forced to share space with ancient bathroom humor. Scholars didn't know what to do with that. When they found drawings that were clearly, well, adult in content, they quietly locked them in something they literally called the Gabinetto Segreto, or secret cabinet. In Naples, visitors needed special permission to view what Pompeii had really looked like, a city alive, body, and unfiltered. They were polite enough to label it erotic art. But really, it was daily life left in chalk. Even today, excavations keep revealing layers of this voice. The streets of Pompeii are like an open diary. Half the pages burned, but the ink still bright. Some graffiti appeared to be personal dedications. Secundus loves Iris. I was here and wrote this with my own hand. Others were fragments of songs, recipes, insults. One inscription found in a tavern says, with perfect dry humor, "Nicias, don't dirty the fountain." 2,000 years later, that's still good advice. Graffiti stretched across every surface available. Houses, pillars, even tombs. It filled gaps between public records. Names of freed slaves appeared next to magistrates. Love poems shared space with wine menus. It is not the history of Rome you learn in textbooks. It est the version that smells of bread ovens and spilled wine. Eventually, linguists realized graffiti wasn't just funny, it was linguistic gold. It showed how Latin actually sounded. Official Latin, the kind Cicero spoke, is polished and severe. Graffiti Latin is wild, full of slang and shortcuts. Imat. I love you becomes simply imat. Like a text message, missing punctuation. Endings blur, spellings wander, verbs collapse under passion or laziness. If you've ever texted something like "Omo" or "See you soon," congratulations, you write like a Roman wall artist. In fact, Pompeii provides some of the earliest known abbreviations. SPQR. That famous Roman motto, meaning the Senate and the people of Rome, had cousins like Emici, shortened to Emic. Felix chopped to fail. The graffiti proved that language has always been flexible, instinctive, and occasionally careless. Latin wasn't just the language of empire, it was also the sound of drunk couples arguing about dinner. Beyond the words, though, graffiti gave historians something rarer: emotion preserved. In one narrow hallway of Pompeii's House of the Faun, a scroll reads simply, "I have seen the envy of my friends." It's so human and slightly bitter you can feel the sigh behind it. Another says, "If you're sleepy, lie down. Here it's free." Hospitality meets sarcasm, and on one wall near the city gates, there's the haunting line, "Nothing lasts forever, not even happiness." It might be the closest thing to an epitaph the city ever wrote for itself. Picture it, that sentence carved before the eruption, intended as casual wisdom, now standing, eternal, under volcanic ash. The irony writes itself. Visitors in the 19th century found these messages bizarrely intimate. Victorian travelers came, expecting ruins grand and solemn. Instead, they found graffiti poking fun at death, politics, and love. One English visitor complained in his journal that the Pompeians seemed distressingly modern. He meant it as criticism. He wasn't wrong. Modern scholars, though Love that contradiction. Graffiti bridges to worlds the mythic and the mundane. It turns ancient history from marble statue into living face. You can trace personalities through handwriting, humor through phrasing, class through spelling mistakes. In one bakery, dozens of names repeat across the walls: employees, customers, even children scribbling numbers. It's the ancient equivalent of a Facebook wall. Maybe the owner didn't like it, but he clearly never got around to repainting. There's also something oddly democratic about graffiti's survival. Rome built monuments to emperors that weathered away. Graffiti survived precisely because nobody cared enough to destroy it. Negligence became preservation. The careless scratches outlived the marble propaganda. Every I was here outlasted. 1,000 here lies the great. It's tempting to see that as poetic justice, the common man's victory over official history. But maybe it's simpler. People wrote what felt real in the moment, not what would impress eternity, and that honesty gave their words permanence. Centuries crumble. Honesty doesn't. Now, a curious cycle has begun. Modern visitors, inspired by ancient scrolls, sometimes leave their own names in hidden corners of Pompeii. It horrifies archaeologists, of course, but it's also strangely fitting. Rome's walls were always crowded. Silence would feel unnatural. Every time someone sneaks a pencil across a ruin, they join a tradition thousands of years old. The urge never really changed. Humans keep trying to remind the world, I existed. That phrase, in all its forms, might be the oldest confession in history. So, what do these messages tell us about the Romans? That they were funny, insecure, romantic, jealous, observant, and maybe a little too chatty, which is to say they were exactly like us. Graffiti shrinks the empire back down to human size. Behind every great conquest and marble forum were people doodling on bathroom walls, dreaming about lovers, bragging about dinners, and complaining about landlords. It is humbling to realize that the most realistic portrait of ancient Rome isn't painted on canvas or etched on coins. It's hidden on its walls. The citizens imagined themselves giants of civilization, but the traces they left behind were small, almost childish, on somehow more immortal than their monuments. There's a quiet comfort in that thought. Volcanoes may fall silent, cities may turn to dust, but the smallest act of expression, one line, one joke, one longing sentence can survive all of it. Pompeii's graffiti isn't just evidence of history, it's proof of persistence, that no matter how many empires rise or fall, the same instincts remain: to write, to laugh, to love, to complain out loud. Even eternity, it seems, has room for bad spelling and borrowed poetry. So maybe when you stand before those ancient walls, what you're really looking at isn't Rome's past, it's our reflection. The oldest voice in the world, saying what everyone, sooner or later, wants to say. I was here, remember me. And 2,000 years later, we still do.